My name is Jenny Trout-Tadero. I'm a structural engineer at AISC, and I'd like to welcome you to the Structural Engineering and Equity. Did it work? No, it didn't work. There we go. Structural Engineering, Engagement and Equity, SE3 presentation. Our speakers are Andrea Reynolds and Bethany Ryder. Andrea is Smith's Group Director of Structural Engineering. Andrea oversees the structural design of concrete, steel, wood, masonry, and cold-form metal structures for a diverse mix of clients and building types. She has worked on many interesting projects, including sports stadiums, military installations, research centers, museums both in the U.S. and across the globe. She's developed solutions for extreme loading scenarios, blast, progressive collapse, hurricane, tornado, and seismic. She is involved in the industry at large as the director of the Southeast Michigan chapter of CME and the chair of the Structural Engineering Exam Committee. Thank you, Andrea. Bethany is in her second career. She originally started in transportation engineering. She then took 20 years at home raising children, and Bethany then graduated from Purdue with her MSCE in structures in 2015 and began her structural career. She currently works at Smith Group in Detroit, Michigan. Bethany has served in the NCSCA SE3 committee for 2 years and recently started a WISE group in our Women in Structural Engineering group in the Detroit metro area. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm glad to see that you're awake. I'm not, so this ought to go really well. So I want to talk a little bit about what is the Structural Engineering Engagement and Equity Committee. It is a part of the NCSEA, National Council of Structural Engineering Associations. And what we study is how well we actually are doing in the structural engineering field as far as engagement and equity. The current chair of our committee is Rose McClure. She works for Simpson, Gumpertz, and Heger, and I think she's in San Francisco. She's in Chicago. She's in Chicago. With the past chairs were Angie Sommers and Nick Sherrill Groves. Our mission is to raise awareness and promote dialogue on engagement, retention, and equity in our profession, to attract and retain the best talent, and to ensure that all structural engineers have a pathway to success in their careers. What we have done in the past is we've put out biennial surveys. We started in 2016 with our first survey, and in 2018 we put out another survey. And so what we're going to present to you today are going to be the results of the 2018 survey. We also put together a resource guide for the member organizations across the country in case you are interested in starting an SE3 chapter or local organization. And you'll get to hear more about the resource guide in a little bit. The ways in which we do this is we go through and we send out the survey, and we pull back in all the feedback, and then we analyze all the data and present all the data to the general public so that we can help educate you a little bit about kind of what's going on nationwide regarding our industry. So the 5 topics that we study in our survey are demographics. So who are we surveying, and what are their I don't know, demographics is the best word. Sorry, I'm trying to explain it. We do study satisfaction and retention in the field. This includes burnout. So this is a kind of a hot topic in our industry. We'll hear more about that. We talk about career development. How well are we doing when it comes to developing our engineers? We also talk about pay and compensation, which another hot topic. You'll get to hear more about that. And work-life balance. How are we doing in keeping our engineers balanced so that they actually can, go for the long career? So let's talk a little bit about demographics. We surveyed 2,100 people in 2016, and at the time since the survey, the SE3 committee started in California, predominantly, like I say, over half of the respondents were from California. But in 2018, we had more of a nationwide push. And you can see now the spread. The ones in the darkest color had more than 150 people respond within their state. So we're moving across the USA, and we're bringing in more data. So we're getting more of a big picture. As far as gender, who responded, we had about 70% men and about 30% women. We had a couple percent who said they really didn't want to tell us, which is fine. And then we had very few, I think 3 respondents that were considered non-binary. This is pretty similar to about how much of the breakdown of the respondents were in 2016 as well. By age, you can see we have a spread as far as the bulk of the people who responded are between the less than 30 and up to 50 years of age, but we even had some respondents that were greater than 70. I don't know if I'll still be here at 70, so we'll see. As far as gender and position, we have a breakdown. The majority of our respondents were project engineers and project managers, and then you can see the darkest color, which is a burgundy, is the women, and the blue is the men. So if you look at project manager, you can see we had 28% of the respondents were project managers, 72% of those were men, and 28% were women. And one of the things that's important about this slide is you actually look at the ratio of men to women in the higher level, positions. You can see that you only have like about 16% of women in the principal and CEO position. Breakdown of race. 80% of our respondents were white. And the rest were considered non-white, if you want to call it that. But it was an interesting breakdown because you still have 9% who were Asian and about 5% who were what they consider a mixed race, and then a smattering of others. Not that they're not important, we just don't have as many in the field. Position by race was another interesting thing. If you look at white versus non-white, so the white race is all the dark blue in this case, and you can see that predominantly the spread is a lot of white people. You have the non-white, again, the same issue in the principal CEO position. We only have about 14% who are not white. As far as sexual orientation, we have 91% who are straight. We have approximately 6%, and I can't read that on my screen. 6%. Can anybody read that? Yeah. You can read that at least? Okay, we're good. So we actually had an interesting conversation last night, and we're like, well, how do we do nationally? Because what's the national average of people who are straight? And it's something like 97%. So we have 91%. More information. As far as English as a first language, excuse me, we have approximately 90% who have English as a first language, and then a whole plethora of different ones in there that do not speak English as a first language. As far as the respondents with children, this was interesting because you get about a 50-50 split on people who have kids versus people who don't have kids. But when it comes down to it, there were more women who did not have children than there were men. So there were more men that had a tendency to have children. And this actually will come to play later in our results.
Good morning, everyone. So it's a good thing we're all engineers because you're going to see a lot of data and a lot of numbers. We're going to start digging into some of the actual responses to the questions besides just the demographics. We're going to start with satisfaction and retention. So when we look at the data, the good news is it looks like a majority of us are actually satisfied with our careers and our choice to go into structural engineering. In 2016, the satisfied and the very satisfied were a little bit higher than they are, but they're very close. It was 80%, 81% as compared to 78% this time. The one difference out of the satisfied and very satisfied people between the two surveys is we've seen the numbers of the very satisfied people go down a little bit from what we saw in 2016. When we looked at the very dissatisfied categories, it was interesting because if you look just at the simple question, are you satisfied with your career? And we looked at it by race. Interestingly, Asians and blacks responded that they were not very dissatisfied with their career. In fact, none of them responded that way. But when you look at a multivariate analysis, you see trends in all the different questions that we asked related to satisfaction, and we actually found, using a statistical analyst that was working with us, that Asians and blacks are actually seem to be more dissatisfied with their career choice than any of the other races as they were represented. And then looking at the titles, and keep in mind when we talk about the titles, the staff, principal, associate, that's all self-reported. To some degree, there could be some discrepancies on how people are answering that or how they're representing themselves, because each company is a little different in how they're set up. So their titles might not necessarily fully fit one of those categories. But when we looked at the data, the associates and shareholders were really the category that was most very dissatisfied, which is interesting when you think about, you would think your shareholders would be the happy ones, right? So some of the things that were indicators of career satisfaction. If firm morale was high, people were 5.7% more likely to be very satisfied with their careers. If they had a positive experience with dependents, it was 8.2% more likely to be very satisfied with their career. And then finally, if they had positive experience with leadership or had respect for the leadership within their office, they were 6% more likely. So those are some of the things that we can pull into, as we run our businesses and interact with our employees. Those are some things that we should think about and focus on, and how we could potentially raise that satisfaction level within the industry. So we asked, have you considered leaving the industry? It's about a 60-40 split. When you look at it, though, women were much more likely, maybe not necessarily much more likely, but they were more likely to consider leaving the industry. We saw slightly different results from 2016, mainly because we were asking different questions and more pointed questions about this particular item. So, building on considering leaving the industry, we also asked, how long do you plan to stay in the industry? And when you look at the numbers, about 80% of us said we're going to stay in the industry for at least 6 or more years, which is good to hear. The numbers as far as who is thinking about leaving is about 7%, but those are the 7%, especially in today's day and age where there seems to be a talent shortage, particularly in STEM careers, that we really should try to focus on and see how we can improve that. And then naturally about 20% of the people, or about 17% of the people, were not sure what they were going to do, probably trying to still figure out what they're going to do when they grow up. Just like the rest of us, right? So looking at the people that, mapping out the people that plan to stay in the industry until retirement with respect to age, you can see it gradually increases. Starts off good, you get out of college, you're gonna take over the world, right? Well, as we all probably experienced, you kind of get that awakening after a year or two of experience, and you realize, is this what I really signed up for? Is this what I really want to do for the rest of my life? So you can see as you approach about 2 years of experience, the desire to stay in the industry until retirement plummets. We started about 60%. You can see also that for whatever reason, female and non-binary tend to track lower in the likelihood of staying in the industry till retirement. Once you get past the 2 years, things start to pick up again. Probably get the idea of, all right, I know what I'm doing now. I feel more comfortable. I can do this. I have no desire to necessarily leave. So you get about 10 years, and you get that 10-year itch. And it looks like about 20 years, you get that 10-year itch again. So you see the couple pinch points on the graph. What's interesting, though, and looking at the graph too, the blue line is male, the plumb line is the female or non-binary, and non-binary, and the yellow line is the average. So you can see that the yellow line is tracking a little bit closer to the blue line mainly because more of our respondents were male than female. But when you look closely, you notice that females actually had another dip beyond the 2 year, between the 2 and 10 year time frame. So really that first 10 years for females is pretty tough. And it takes about 12 years before you get above 50% for females wanting to stay in the industry till retirement. Now, part of that could be due to, having children, and there's tough decisions that people make relative to that. But we probably want to look at, what does this really mean? And similar to what the AIA is looking at, they call it they're missing 42%. They actually have the luxury of having a lot more females entering into their industry than we do. When you look at the numbers, they're closer to 50-50, and we're probably about 13, or at best, looking at these numbers, maybe 30%, but that's probably not necessarily representative of what's entering our industry. So not only how long are you going to stay in the industry, we also ask how long are you going to stay at the firm that you're currently at. And you can see, while people are more likely to stay in the industry, they are less likely to stay in their firms. And that makes sense. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's maybe not great for those of us employing people and trying to keep good people, but it's still a pretty low percentage that are looking to leave their firm within the next 5 years. And again, we still have about the 20% of people that are still on the fence about what they want to do as far as how it relates to their firm. So some of the things that seem to affect retention the most was your satisfaction with what you're doing on a daily basis. If you're happy with what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, you're naturally more likely you're gonna be more likely to want to stay in your firm and stay within the profession. The other thing that's very important is emotional investment. If you have an emotional reaction to what you're doing, you're proud of your work, you feel like you're providing a service to people, you're more likely to stay in the industry as well, which is pretty common sense, right? Other things that affect retention. Gender. It really only seems to affect the numbers related to the people that have responded whether or not they were going to stay in the field until retirement. It doesn't seem to affect whether they're going to stay at their firm. It was really just the profession at large. Naturally, fair treatment by management. If you feel like you're being treated fairly, you're going to be more likely to want to stay at your current position. And then lack of dependence. Those that do not have dependents are less likely to stay at their firm or stay in the industry. Again, it partially makes sense when you think about it because they might have some more freedoms in their life than somebody who's trying to raise children and worrying about putting a meal on the table for a number of people versus just themselves or their spouse. For the first time, we asked questions about discrimination and harassment. The sad truth is we're not free of harassment and discrimination. We're not different than any other industry. This unfortunately exists. As I said, these were new questions. We didn't necessarily define what these meant. So the respondents are self-reporting this. In some cases, they might not necessarily have been comfortable in reporting this information. The important things to note are when it comes to workplace discrimination, 20% of white respondents reported discrimination as opposed to 30%. So non-white are seeing it a little bit more. Generally, we also asked people if they were willing to share what kind of discrimination they felt they experienced in their careers. And for those that answered, it was a myriad of different responses. A lot of it was related to their nationality, people expressing hatred to their country, making assumptions about their ability because what their background is. The silly racist jokes that people think were funny And, back in the day, people made all the time that are not necessarily politically correct anymore. General derogatory comments. When you look at the breakdown between men and women, you can see that females are much more likely, they're 5 times more likely to experience discrimination than men. So 50% of women have reported this in our survey. And generally speaking, what they had responded were the types of discrimination they faced was that they were passed up for jobs, that they didn't feel valued or respected, and that they were ignored in meetings. Looking at the harassment side of things, this was really more of a male-female type issue. I don't think we were surprised to find out that, of course, women were more, that felt they were more harassed than men in the survey. It was 5% versus 32% female that were feeling that way. Again, we asked them to share experiences if they were willing to, and a lot of that was related to inappropriate touching, being propositioned by coworkers and or leadership, sadly, being made uncomfortable. And this isn't just going out on the construction site and dealing with contractors. This was within their own offices just like yours and mine. And so, this is something we need to look at. And like I said, we're obviously not, we're not special. We all face this no matter what industry we're in, but we should probably do something to try to minimize this, of course. So to summarize some of the things that we saw related to career satisfaction, generally structural engineers are satisfied, yay us. Asian and Black respondents were significantly less satisfied. High morale, good dependent care experiences, and good management can help with employee satisfaction. There are 2 pinch points. The first two major pinch points that we should probably look at, the first 2 years and at 10 years. Satisfaction with your daily tasks and good management helps increase retention. And of course, there's discrimination and harassment that we should delve into and try to fix.
Okay, talking about career advancement. Interestingly, when we surveyed, we found that principals are more likely to believe that they're doing a fantastic job portraying the expectations for advancement. And that's not necessarily true down in the ranks, so it's something to definitely keep in mind. We found that 51.6% of the respondents agreed that management clearly communicated. So if you think that principals they've communicated it all well, only about half of their employees think that they've communicated it well. The breakdown by gender is about 55% of male and 44% of female believe that they have been communicated the proper ways to advance. And further breaking down by race, 53% of white and 47% of non-white believe that they've been given what they need for knowing how to advance. 52% of all respondents aspire to be a principal. In most cases, roughly only half expect that they'll actually make it to that level. And the expectations of the non-white is actually notably lower. So by about, a few percent, 10%. Sorry, I'm not doing math like this early in the morning. We have 20% of the white respondents expect to be able to achieve the principal level versus 19% of the non-white respondents. So about a quarter of the people think that they can actually do it as far as the white people, but only 20% if you're non-white. Mentorship. This has been a hot topic for a long time. 75% of all our respondents have had a mentor at some point in their career. That could be, I don't think we specified when we asked the question whether that was currently a mentor or past mentor, but sometime in their career they've had a mentor. let's see, 79% of the male respondents have had a mentor versus 77 of female. So we're doing pretty good on this one. I feel like the data shows that we've got a good 3/4% of our people, or 3/4 of our people are actually getting mentorship. It's the other quarter that we probably need to pay attention to. So mentorship, how does it affect the people who are actually leaving the industry? We all know that we have people leaving the industry, and it's a problem in our industry, but does mentorship have an impact on it? And we found through our statistics that 19% of the people who responded that they did not have a mentor were more likely to consider leaving. So if you figure we got 75% of the people who said they had a mentor, well, those 25% of the people who didn't have a mentor, 19% of them are more likely to leave. And actually, if you break that down a little bit farther, 15% say that they're going to leave within the first 5 years. How does mentorship impact our satisfaction in our job? 84% who have had a mentor are satisfied or very satisfied. 66% who have not had of respondents who do not have or have not had a mentor are satisfied. This is where we start seeing that gap between those who had a mentor and didn't. As far as advancement by gender, interestingly enough, our data showed that women are advancing faster than men in our industry from their current, in comparison to men. And then additionally, those who do not have children are advancing more quickly. So if you're not a woman and you don't have kids, if you're a woman and you have no kids, you're advancing fairly quickly within the industry. And that's what the statistics are showing. So a few of the metrics that we found that define success in the people who responded are successful outcomes of projects, positive client relationships, respect from the staff, and effective management of others. And these are ones that across the board, everybody tends to agree that these are important. Additionally, we have two other metrics that we think are important, and that's job title and compensation. In this bar graph, please don't look at them as far as numbers, more as a relative comparison. We're going to kind of break this down a little bit. When we talk about male and female, we find that the plum color, I wanted to call it burgundy, but plum's good. I like plum. And the plum color is women. And then the dark blue color, we need a good name for that one. I don't know, we'll call it dark blue, is men. So the three things that are most important to women, according to our survey, is respect from the staff, effective management by others, and then their job title. Whereas with men, we found compensation was one of their greatest definitions of success. If you break it down to white and non-white, so the non-white are the yellow. If you break it down, then you find that the non-white, their most important factors are actually job title and compensation. Now keep in mind, these are kind of like not huge differences, because across the board, the first four, everybody pretty much agrees are important metrics of success, but we also have those other two that come in because they're very close in percentage. We found that for the white respondents, the positive relationship with their clients is a huge definition of success for them. A little bit of a summary, 75% of our surveys respondents had a mentor, which I think that's an excellent number. I don't set the standard of that, whether or not the number is excellent, but I think it's good. Women and other minorities are slightly less likely to have a mentor. Those who do not have a mentor, 19% more likely to consider leaving and are more likely to be dissatisfied with their advancement. Principals more likely to believe the expectations for advancement are clearly communicated. Women respondents advanced to their current position at a faster rate than men, and then respondents with children advanced at a slower rate than those without children. Most respondents define career success similarly, which are those first four metrics that we put up there. And women value position and title more and compensation less than men do. Non-whites tend to value both of those, which is the position and title, higher than non-white respondents.
All right, so let's look at the numbers for pay and compensation. Let's show me the money, right? So when we look at pay by position, naturally, as you progress in your career, your pay should also progress. You can see the blue numbers are the average, the yellow numbers are the median salaries. This included not just your salary, but also included bonuses and other monetary compensation. And as you can see, the medians are consistently a bit lower than what the averages are. Breaking it down by gender, you can see that we start off pretty equal, male and female, or male and female and non-binary. But as we get further on in our years of experience, the men start to progress and make more money than females do. That gap really starts to widen. Part of that could be the amount of respondents. We haven't necessarily looked at this data specifically by the number of respondents for each age category. I would imagine that a lot of our females tend to be on the younger side based on some of the other graphs that we'll see further on. So that could be impacting some of those numbers at the higher end. Also, keep in mind, these numbers are reported for across the country. And so depending on how many males are in that category that are on the West Coast or in, say, New York City, versus how many females are like me from the Midwest, those could also be skewing the numbers a little bit based on cost of living differences. And as we get past 35 years of experience, because there are fewer respondents, the data really is even more or less reliable. So that's why we're only reporting up to 35 years of experience, even though we had people that had much more that replied. Then we look at the average pay by position. Again, looking at the gender difference, you can see there's still a pretty big gap between those positions. Again, location and geographic aspects might play a role in this. But also, when you think about the graph that Bethany had just presented, that females are progressing faster than males, we could also be seeing a little bit of that reflected in these pay differences. So if a female is accelerating faster in their career, they get to the principal level before the males, they might actually be making a little bit less. And that doesn't necessarily excuse it or define it, but it helps us understand why that might exist. We ask questions about overtime. About 50% of us are not compensated for overtime. Some of those the people that out of the 50% that are compensated, it could be in pay, it could be in comp time. You can see the breakdown in the different categories. Some of them get to choose between the two. These numbers were not drastically different from what we saw in 2016. And I guess the other thing to point out of the 50% that do not get paid overtime, about 20% of those people had said that they do get compensated for it in some way. It gets reflected in their bonus. The interesting thing about overtime is that there really seemed to be no correlation between overtime and satisfaction. If you get paid overtime, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're more satisfied with your career. In 2016, we found that this was different. So we don't necessarily know what has changed or potentially changed in the industry, but that's where we are. We looked into negotiation. We asked questions about negotiation. Generally speaking, women are a little bit less likely to negotiate for either pay or benefits. The top line for each of the male and female categories is the pay. The bottom line is compensation, so that could be negotiating for things like vacation, moving expenses, signing bonus, those sorts of things. While it's pretty close to being equal as far as percentage of male to female negotiating for those items, women are a lot less successful at it. I don't know why. I don't know are we just not persistent enough? Is it because we're negotiating with males and it's just a harder negotiation for us? I don't know. When we look at the pay based on those that negotiated for pay or compensation, you can see that those that did negotiate are a little bit more likely to get paid a little bit higher than those that did not. So obviously negotiating pays off a little bit. But when you look at the numbers, obviously it's not a drastic difference in that until you really get to the principal level. And here's the fun slides. So take the money, take the dollar signs out of it. Don't try to equate anything to your actual salary because math probably won't work out. But let's look at the different things that we found that affect pay and the relative effect that they have to each other. So the things that tend to decrease our pay are things like if you're a sole practitioner, that's the biggest thing to decrease your pay, which is kind of sad when you think about it. You probably have this ideal that I'm going to go out and I'm going to start my own business and take over the world, and it doesn't obviously work out as well as you would think. Daily tasks, if you're doing things like CAD or basic design, you're going to have a lower pay. Makes sense because you're early in your career at that point in time. And then, interestingly, if you don't have dependents, you tend not to get paid as much. Why is this? I don't know. Perhaps it could be when we look at the numbers that Bethany had presented about how females are less likely to have dependents. And we just saw the graphs that show that females get paid less than males. Perhaps that is one of the explanations for this. That's one of the things that we want to dive into a little bit more. When we look at the things that predict increased pay, so what can we do to get paid more, right? Your position is the single biggest impact. So, which makes sense, again. The higher position you are, the more likely you are to get paid more. Principal is naturally the biggest predictor for increased pay. What's interesting when you look at it, being a male in a principal is naturally much more lucrative than being a female in a principal. Location is the next thing that impacts this, which makes sense as well. Bay Area cities, Oakland, California, New York, New Jersey, San Francisco, Chicago, those are the areas that you tend to get paid more. But of course, when you think about it, the cost of living is a lot different as well. So relatively speaking, we haven't delved into those numbers enough to understand, is it relative to the cost of living, what is the difference there? And then experience were things that do tend to predict increased pay, but they obviously have a less effect. Every additional 100 people in your firm, each additional hour you work per week, each additional year of experience, those are all good things to help increase your pay theoretically, but obviously not as big as where you live and what position you have. There were a few other categories or other items that we looked at. If you're full-time versus part-time, that makes sense, right? If you have a master's degree, if childcare is provided by your partner, which is interesting because this isn't necessarily taking into the account of your partner's salary. It's really looking only at your salary. But if you have children and you have a spouse that's taking care of your children, you're still likely to make more money. So some of the things that we asked from the statistical analysis was looking more deeply into the gender pay gap. So a lot of the items that affect one gender or affect pay affect both genders. But when you look at all of those individual items and look at each one of those separately, the effect on women was skewing the results so that their pay was lower than those results compared to men. So whether you had more years of experience, whether you had dependents, whether your partner's providing childcare, all those things are skewing the numbers down, saying that women are getting paid a little bit less than males. So some of the findings that we had, to summarize what we had in this category: men and women negotiate pay equally, but men are obviously more successful at it. Those that do negotiate make a little bit more money than those that don't. Sole practitioners, unfortunately, make substantially less than their peers when all else is constant. Position and location are the biggest predictors of increased pay. Pay gap increases with the years of experience. The gender pay gap increases with years of experience. And then holding all else constant, only the principal title really seems to affect pay gap directly and most significantly. I'm going to talk about work-life balance.
All right, work-life balance, flexibility, and children. When it comes to work-life balance, we found that roughly 50% of the people who responded said that they were satisfied with their work-life balance. We've got about 23% who are neutral. So depending on how you want to look at it, you could say, well, we've got 80% that are either neutral or satisfied, or 80% that are not dissatisfied, which I think is something that came out earlier in the presentation. So this is a little bit much to look at, but bear with me for a moment. If you look at this in aggregate, we can see that about, so you can see what percentage of the structural engineering firms are offering which flexibility benefit. Then we see that we compare that to which benefits a survey respondent said that they would like to use, or that if it was available, they would use it. And you can see there's a couple places in which we have quite a significant difference. There are big gaps between what benefits are being offered and which would be used, mainly when we're talking about like the parental leave, a weekly schedule flexibility, and working remotely. Oops, I'm losing my cursor. Yep, back we go. I can't read this on here. How do I jump out of the little pointer thing? We should be able to just... Yeah, I tried that. Just turn it off.
Oh, come on.
Sorry, this little pointer thing is like throwing me off.
I don't know.
All right, well, there's a pointer on there, and apparently it's, do you know how to take the
I don't know, but it's press escape. See if that works.
I'm afraid I'm going to jump out of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Ah, you're on it, girl. So what happens when you try to learn something like right before the presentation?
How to use a pointer on
Yeah, I know, isn't that terrible? It's like, I can learn SAP and all those kinds of things, but how to use a pointer? I mean, forget it. So the differences are mainly when we're talking about taking parental leave, weekly schedule flexibility, and working remotely. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the stigmas we have actually regarding those. Other benefits that were actually more balanced between what's offered and what's desired is parental leave with a partial salary and benefit, daily schedule flexibility. So the daily part of it, they really value, and that is also being offered. And the reduced schedules and the options for extended leaves of absence. So those are a little bit more balanced with what companies are offering and people are actually using or desiring to use. While 70% of respondents indicated that they would work remotely, there's a stigma for employees who do. Interestingly enough, when I started, I work remote 1 day a week, and when I started doing that, never fails, one person in my department said, well, now we'll never get any work out of you. Okay. Believe it or not, the stigma is real. I'm sure many of you have seen it before. It's also true that when we look at this data by gender and race, we also see a stigma in that as well. Interesting, when you ask a similar question about people who work reduced schedules, we actually didn't see a stigma for people who work a reduced schedule. 21% of survey respondents have taken a leave. So that's a pretty good chunk of people who actually have taken a leave. And for this survey, we considered a leave of absence is a period of at least 1 year or more that you take away from your career. while you still kind of are the employee of the company. No matter the reason for the level of absence, we found that respondents who had actually taken one were just as likely to desire to remain in the profession afterwards as their colleagues who had not taken one, which is kind of significant because a lot of people think, hey, a woman goes out on maternity leave, which is not the only way to take a leave of absence, but people tend to think, oh, she went on maternity leave, well now, she's going to stay home, and it does happen, but there doesn't seem to be any data to signify saying that, hey, well, because they took a leave of absence, they're not going to return to their career. We just don't find that in the data. So basically, employees shouldn't be worried so much about taking a leave of absence and having that affect your career later. And actually, the data doesn't have any results in that way. I lost my cursor again. Man, I'm losing it.
It's on the other screen.
It's on the other screen? I don't know. All right, I'm losing the cursor thing. As far as perceived impacts on leave, women actually felt that taking a leave of absence had a negative impact, even though the data doesn't show it. They actually felt that way. Men felt that taking a leave of absence actually has a positive effect on their career. So, hey, take a break, get things back in order. It's interesting, the perceptions, because the data just flat out doesn't show that it has any kind of a big impact on your career. So as far as productivity after having children and motivation for advancement after having children, both women and men's productivity is most likely to stay the same or increase after having children. But women are slightly less motivated to advance their career after they've had children. We did find that women are providing more of the child caregiving or the dependent caregiving than men are outside of the work hours, and you're going to see that here in the coming slide as well. So you see the big bars in the middle? This is where we say my partner and I equally are sharing the child care. About 50% are saying that. But if you look at the one above that where it says I provide the primary child care giving, you'll see that the women say 40% of them say that they're the predominant provider of child care versus 5% of men. And then if you flip that and look at it from the other perspective, just below the large bar it says my partner provides more of the child care giving. We're saying the men are saying, 34% of men say, yes, my spouse or my partner is providing the child care. So you can see there's a big trend that women are out there being the primary provider of the children, or primary caregiver of the children, whether they're working or not. So interestingly enough, we found that we did poll and find out that there's a stigma about people who have children. The people without children said that they're more likely to feel like they're putting in more effort, or they're expected to do more overtime, or they kind of have to need to pick up the slack for the people who do have children. Remember the pay section, that having children is a predictor of higher pay? So this kind of, you get paid more, but people think you're slacking. I don't know what's going on there. So some of our key findings, there are some large gaps between flexibility benefits desired and those offered. There's negative stigma to employees who work remotely or reduce schedules, despite the fact that people actually desire to work remotely or reduce their schedule. People without children believe that they're working harder and longer than their coworkers who do have children. And women are more likely than men to believe that a leave of absence actually has a negative impact on their career. And women are just slightly less motivated to advance their career after they've had children. And women are providing more of the child care duties outside of the working hours.
So you guys done with numbers at this point, data? We're just about done here. So talking about some of the activities that our committee's continuing to work on, as well as some of the resources that are available regarding the SE3 studies, surveys that we've done. First off, let's talk about some of the areas for improvement. We talked about all the key findings from each category. There's a few areas that we want to focus on more. Some of that's just us in the industry, how can we improve this so we can improve these numbers over time? But also, as our committee, how can we dig into some of this information and understand it better? So one thing, consideration of minorities, in particular, when we looked at the very dissatisfied respondents, those were Asian and African American, unfortunately. So what can we do to try to make them feel more satisfied with their careers? How can we better understand the geographic differences? Like I said, this was the survey at large, the nation at large. But what are the differences, not just necessarily in pay, but there could be cultural differences in the cities that we live in and how benefits that are offered or how we interact in the workplace. But naturally, over time, we're getting more and more mobile. People are transferring across the country. I mean, even our committee chair just moved from San Francisco to Chicago. So what might be some of the differences she could experience in those two different regions? And naturally, the gender pay gap, trying to understand what is behind those numbers a little bit better. And of course, how can we improve that gap? And then finally, how can we address those career pinch points? We don't want to lose people from our industry. I'm sure all of us experience either we're getting more work dumped on us because we don't have enough staff to share the work with, or those of us that are employing people are probably struggling to find good people. So we want to keep those people in our industry. Activity-wise, some of the things that we're looking at are the focus studies. Some of it's on the previous items for improvement, as well as some other categories that are interesting to us. And a lot of it relates to geographical, gender, and racial differences between some of the survey data that we got from respondents. At the NCSEA National Summit that is in November, we're working on trying to schedule some events that are specific for SE3. So if you guys attend the NCSEA Summit, please join us at those. And then finally, outreach. How can we share this information with others, get people more activated, and helping to boost equity and engagement within our industry? And then as far as what are the resources available? So we have a resource guide. This is to help, primarily it's written to the SEAs, the different chapters, to help them, help engage them and understand how their member organizations can get more active with SE3, as well as in their local communities. What's inside? There's a lot of data. How to plan events. What type of events should you have? Ways to communicate, ways to recruit, marketing, budgeting, all those sorts of things. And there's even some example events that you could host. And then if you want to see the resource guide, you can download it from the NCSEA website. As we mentioned, Rose is our committee chair. Her email is rfmcclure@sgh.com. We also have an email that you can email the group itself at se3@ncsea.com. And if you would like to join our committee, everybody's welcome. We have conference calls once a month, the second Tuesday of every month. And we have different focus groups among that, so those aren't necessarily the only calls or activities that we have, but that's the easiest way to first get involved. And then finally, the assessment question. What is the name of the committee that is focused on equity and engagement of structural engineers? And really looking for the acronym, which is?
Woo! We did our job.
Yeah, we didn't put anybody to sleep. That's a good sign.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys all for joining us. Are there any questions?
So you talked about the difference between genders and their feelings of whether leave affected their absence. And I have two questions for that. One is that filtered just by people who actually took a leave, or was that just people who had and have into their perception of taking a leave? And then the second that goes along with is, how did you measure whether it affected them?
Repeat the question. You have to repeat it in the mic.
So the question was, now I lost my train of thought. So the first part of the question was whether or not, or whether the results that we looked at as far as the people that took their leave, if it was all respondents or if it was specifically the people that took the leave, correct?
Yeah, when you showed the data about the perception of taking leave, right?
Oh, so when it came to the perception, I believe it was all people, the entire respondents. And then, I'm sorry, could you repeat your second question? Because now I totally lost my train of thought.
Okay, the second question is, how did you, and maybe you said this and I missed it, but how did you measure whether or not taking leave affected their career?
So how did we measure whether or not leave affected their career? And that was really them self-reporting it. So,
Okay, just, yes.
It was
Yeah.
their perception.
yeah,
Got it.
yes.
I just have some comments. First of all, thank you so much to everyone who's started this group and involved with this group. I think it's been a long time coming, and it's very, very important work. I'm one of your outliers. I have 33 years of experience, so I'm going to tail in. But just a couple anecdotes of where we've come from. And I started work in the mid-'80s, and I don't happen to have dependents. But some things I've been told along the way, having no dependents, less pay, I've heard, but he has a family to support. That was the 80s. In 2008, I did a little talk at a seminar, and a principal for a small firm revealed that he had a concern for hiring young women because they'll just get pregnant and leave. A comment about the no children. Is it possible that some of us without dependents are actually pressured to work more because we don't have children? So that may be just a thing to think about. And then anecdotally, I've heard and experienced that women engineers often marry other engineers or highly technical people with demanding careers. So when there is a family involved, it's sort of double pressure on the woman as to whose career gets a little more focus. But thank you so
Yeah.
much for all your work.
Yeah, those are all great points. One of the other things I'd like to reiterate too is that, we talked about the survey results from 2016 and then today's results about the 2018 survey. Our intention is to do a survey every 2 years, and so that we can track these things over time and see how the industry is changing. Because, naturally, I'm sure when you started your career, it was quite different than it is today.
Yeah.
So when you, I think, I've taken both surveys, but I think one of the questions in the second survey was, did you take the survey before?
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys have a sense of that data? Is it, 75% overlap? Do you have 50% overlap? Do you guys know?
I don't know that we actually I don't believe that we actually broke that down yet, but that's something we might be able to take a look at. That's a great
Or just
idea.
curious to see, not necessarily comparing, trying to connect any people, but just this, 50% of our respondents participated in both, because it
Right.
would just be interesting to see.
Right. No, that's actually a great idea, and we may want to look at that, because that will give us an idea of how we spread over the years, how well we're actually spreading across the United States. So thank you for that input.
We'll start with Tricia. And then we'll move to the left.
Just an observation, and similarly, I guess, supporting what Jean said, I'd like to think that the gender pay gap that we're showing is a reflection of what's happened in the past. So it's an institutionalized gender pay gap that hasn't been fixed. But if you look at from 0 to 7 or 10 or 12 years, we're pretty close.
Mhm.
So I'd like to think that's not a predictive index, but that's just, we're going to flush that out.
Yeah.
And that's never going to be seen again.
Yeah, hopefully we're headed in the right direction
Right. I mean,
respect
I would
to
really
that.
challenge employers to get on board and realize that they're at that gap.
Yeah.
If they have a 30-year principal, they should damn well pay that woman equal to what they're paying their men. But anyway, I'd like that, and I'm in charge of our pay, so.
So
I'm not
just
worried
keep
about
that in mind.
Yeah, for sure.
Natalie, did you have a question? No? There was a question back there.
My question is, does the survey look at all of these things in relation to what field you're in? Like, if you work for a consulting firm or a contractor or an architectural firm?
No, this was mainly for people structural engineers in the field, but we didn't necessarily look at it what type of structural engineering or what type of firm that they're employed at. There were a few things that we did look at, and it's escaping me in particular what one of them was. I believe it was with the work-life balance. And one of the things that we found was that the results really didn't change depending on what type of firm or what size of firm that you were in. There was no significant trends that we could pull from that data.
So the reason I asked, I work for an architecture firm, and I listened to the presentations about the AIA findings too, but they never look at engineers that work at the architecture firm, so I didn't know that those are different.
Yeah, in that case, they might also want, working at an AE firm myself, they might actually want to look at engineers versus architects rather than male versus female or racial differences as well, because obviously it's very different.
There was also a discussion, or there were questions trying to pinpoint what leaving the industry meant. So it was also a perception. So somebody at first it was like, well, are you in consulting? And then it's like, well, that's kind of restricting because there's a lot of structural engineers that don't work as consultants. So there was a lot of discussion around how to ask the question to include a lot of the respondents. So, but there's a lot of data, and so this is just an hour of the amount of data that was collected. I encourage you to join the phone call that they talked about. That's an hour long, and they keep it to an hour, which is key. And then there's a lot of task groups. So if you have particular interest in any of these topics, you're welcome to join those task groups. They're always looking for volunteers, and even if you're just a listener, it's kind of fun just to listen, which is where I'm at right now. I just listen on the calls. So the next group is coming in, so I wanted to thank, now I'm sitting down, I feel weird. So thank you both for coming, and thanks to all of you for participating. If you have more questions, come on up. I just want to let the next speakers all set up their session. So let's give them a round of applause.